The battlefield looked like the galaxy's ugliest compromise between hope and despair. Prefabricated negotiation pavilions stood in neat rows across scorched ground, where 3 armies had fought 6 months prior, their burn marks still visible beneath the diplomatic carpeting. Captain Darius Kane walked the perimeter with his security detail, scanning for threats that probably wouldn't come but definitely could, because that was his job, and he was good at it even when it felt pointless. 6 weeks they'd been on the Raxus IV. 6 weeks of human diplomats arguing with Veltheran ministers about boundary lines and resource rights, while both sides kept fleets in orbit and pretended the weapons weren't armed. This was the 3rd ceasefire attempt in 2 years. The previous 2 had collapsed into renewed fighting within months. Nobody expected better results this time, but failure was no longer politically acceptable, so they kept talking. Darius's squad spread across the security zone with practiced efficiency. They were good soldiers who'd survived the worst fighting of the war, and understood that vigilance kept people alive even when peace talks made survival feel like the universe's cruel joke. He was checking sensor readings when Lieutenant Tor's voice crackled through his implant with the kind of urgency that precedes disasters. "Captain, Veltheran forces are deploying something. Mass formation at the northern ridge. It's not an attack pattern, it's ceremonial." There, static consumed the transmission. Every alarm in Darius's tactical display lit up simultaneously. The human diplomats inside the main pavilion were receiving similar warnings because he could hear shouting through the walls. Then the ground began to vibrate with the synchronized impact of thousands of armored boots. The Veltheran honor guard crested the ridge in formation, so precise it looked choreographed by mathematics. 5,000 warriors in ceremonial armor that served double duty as functional combat gear, moving with the kind of discipline that came from civilizations older than human space travel. They carried standards displaying sigils Darius had seen on intelligence reports: noble houses, military divisions, the symbols of an empire that had conquered 14 systems before humanity even noticed they existed. Then she appeared. Queen Ashira Kal, the Void Sovereign, the Scar of Stars, the entity personally responsible for human defeats across 7 systems. She wore armor that seemed to absorb light, crowned with a circlet that marked her as absolute monarch of the Veltheran Empire. Even at distance, her presence hit like a physical force, the psychological weight of someone who'd personally led campaigns that shattered defenses and redefined warfare. The effect was immediate and visceral. Human ministers burst from the negotiation pavilions and ran for the transport ships. No dignity, no protocol, just primal flight response triggered by proximity to the most feared entity in the galaxy. Veteran soldiers threw down weapons and sprinted. Darius watched his own squad scatter, their training overridden by instincts screaming that staying near Ashira Kal was suicide. He stood in the security zone and watched evacuation become rout. Transport ships lifted off without waiting for full capacity. Diplomats trampled each other reaching the boarding ramps. Even the Veltheran delegation was retreating to their own transports, though with more dignity than their human counterparts. The battlefield emptied in minutes. Darius found himself standing alone on scorched ground, his tactical display showing him the only human life sign within 3 kilometers. His combat implants were screaming danger protocols. His body wanted to run. Every survival instinct he developed in 5 years of warfare was telling him that remaining in proximity to the Void Sovereign was the worst decision he'd ever made. He stayed, not because he was brave. Bravery implied a choice made despite fear, and Darius wasn't feeling particularly heroic. He stayed because he'd spent 2 years in Veltheran prison camps after the Battle of Crestfall, where he'd learned that running from fear only gave it power. He'd learned that sometimes the only way through terror was to stand in it and wait for it to burn itself out. Also, running now would be tactically pointless. If Ashira wanted him dead, He'd be dead regardless of whether he sprinted for the transport ships or stood his ground. Might as well face it with whatever dignity he could muster. The Queen crossed the battlefield with her honor guard. They moved with the same precise formation, but Ashira herself walked slightly ahead, a position that suggested either absolute confidence or calculated performance. Probably both. She stopped 10 paces from Darius, close enough that he could see details intelligence photos never captured. The scars on her armor from actual combat, the way her eyes shifted color slightly with the light, the fact that she was studying him with the same analytical intensity he was using on her. "You do not run," she said. Her voice carried despite the wind, modulated for command in ways that suggested either natural authority or very good genetic engineering. Darius kept his hands away from his weapons. "Running seemed pointless, Your Majesty. If you wanted me dead, I'd already be dead. If you wanted me alive, running would just delay the inevitable. Seemed more efficient to skip the cardio." One of her guards made a sound that might have been surprise or offense. Ashira's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a micro-adjustment that suggested she was recalculating whatever assumptions she'd made. "You command the human security detail," she said. "Not a question." Commanded, past tense. They made the tactical decision to prioritize survival over watching me make terrible life choices. "Yet you remain." "Yet I remain," Darius agreed. His implant was flooding his vision with warnings about orbital weapons locking onto his position. Both fleets apparently trying to decide whether to fire on a battlefield containing an enemy queen and one of their own soldiers. For what it's worth, this probably isn't helping the peace negotiations. Ashira moved closer, 2 paces, then 1, close enough that his combat training was screaming about threat proximity. She raised her hand and placed it over her heart, a formal gesture that made her entire honor guard stiffen in what looked like surprise. She spoke in her own language, the words carrying weight that transcended translation. His implant processed the meaning half a second later: right of valor, witnessed and bound. Darius had no idea what that meant, but judging by the panicked communications suddenly flooding his implant's priority channels, it was significant and probably complicated in ways that would make the next few hours very unpleasant. "I'm going to need you to translate that in small words," he said. "My Veltharan cultural training stopped at 'don't insult their ears,' and the third fork is for ceremonial dishes." Ashira's eyes were definitely changing color now, shifting towards something that his implant's database suggested indicated either satisfaction or determination. "It means, Captain Kane, that you have done something no warrior has managed in 3 generations. You have earned recognition from the Veltharan crown, and that changes everything." Behind him, Darius could hear transport ships attempting to land despite orbital commands screaming at them not to approach. In front of him, the most feared entity in the galaxy was looking at him with an expression he couldn't parse. "When you say changes everything," Darius said carefully, "are we talking changes everything like a promotion, or changes everything like an interstellar incident that triggers renewed warfare?" "Yes," Ashira said. That was unhelpful. The honor guard maintained their positions while both militaries tried to figure out what to do with a battlefield that now contained the enemy queen, 1 human soldier, and whatever had just been invoked. Darius's implant was receiving contradictory orders: return to human lines immediately, maintain position for extraction, engage hostile forces, do not engage under any circumstances, await further instruction. He ignored all of them and focused on the immediate problem: a queen who just declared something that made her own guards nervous. "Your Majesty," he said, "I appreciate the recognition or binding or whatever just happened. But speaking practically, I'm 1 soldier standing in front of 5,000 of your honor guard. Multiple fleets are currently debating whether to start shooting, and I'm getting messages suggesting that whatever you just did has upset a lot of people on both sides. Maybe we could discuss this somewhere that doesn't have quite so many orbital weapons pointed at it. Ashira studied him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. It transformed her face from the propaganda image of the Void Sovereign into something almost human, though that was probably the worst adjective to use given present circumstances. "The right cannot be revoked once witnessed," she said. "You are bound to my side until formally released or until one of us dies. This will be complicated." "Complicated is better than vaporized," Darius said. "Let's start with complicated and see where it goes." The extraction took another hour of tense negotiations, conducted over open channels, while both militaries watched and waited for someone to make a mistake that would restart the war. Eventually, a joint transport team approached under white flag. Human soldiers and Veltheran honor guard working together with the kind of careful precision that suggested nobody wanted to be the person who triggered galactic conflict through a procedural error. General Thrace herself commanded the human extraction team, which told Darius exactly how seriously command was taking this situation. She was a career officer who'd fought Ashira's forces across multiple campaigns and looked like she'd aged a decade for every year of warfare. Her expression when she saw Darius standing unharmed next to the alien queen was complex enough to require multiple volumes of psychological analysis. "Captain Kane," she said through gritted teeth, "you are ordered to board the transport immediately." "General," Darius replied, "I'd love to comply, but apparently I've been bound by something called the right of valor, and nobody's explained whether that comes with a restraining order or a guest pass." Ashira stepped forward, and every weapon on both sides tracked her movement. "Captain Kane is under the protection of the Veltheran Crown. He will accompany my delegation to neutral ground where proper protocols can be observed." "Absolutely not," Thrace said. "He's a human officer under my command. He returns with human forces." "The right supersedes military jurisdiction," one of Ashira's advisors interjected. He was an older Veltheran whose armor markings suggested high rank. "Your soldier stood before the Void Sovereign and did not flee. By our oldest laws, he is recognized and bound. This cannot be dismissed." The standoff continued with both sides arguing about jurisdiction, while Darius stood in the middle wondering if this was how interstellar wars started, not through grand strategic decisions, but through bureaucratic confusion about whose paperwork took precedence. Finally, Ashira made a decision that surprised everyone. "Captain Kane will accompany both delegations to Station Meridian. It is neutral territory. Both our people maintain presence there. We will resolve this through proper channels, rather than armed standoff." Thrace looked like she wanted to argue, but recognized a reasonable compromise when she heard one. "Agreed, but Captain Kane travels on a human transport." "With Veltheran escort," Ashira countered. They settled on a joint transport, human pilot, mixed security detail, everyone armed and tense but not actively shooting. Darius boarded between General Thrace and two of Ashira's honor guard, feeling like the universe's most unfortunate diplomatic package. The flight to Station Meridian took 3 hours, during which nobody spoke, except to issue necessary flight instructions. Darius spent the time reviewing his implant's cultural database, trying to understand what he'd accidentally triggered. The right of valor was ancient, predating even the Veltheran Empire's expansion into space. It recognized warriors who demonstrated courage in the presence of their monarch, not through victory or glory, but through simple refusal to surrender to fear. The bonded warrior became consort witness, granted authority to stand at the monarch's side in all deliberations, protected by the same laws that protected the crown itself. It was an honor that hadn't been invoked in 3 generations, because finding someone who could stand before absolute authority without fleeing or fighting was apparently very rare. The fact that Ashira had invoked it for a human was unprecedented and politically explosive. Darius was beginning to understand why General Thrace looked like she was contemplating various forms of murder. Station Meridian occupied a stable orbit between contested territories, serving as neutral ground where both species could maintain presence without immediate violence. It was designed by committee, which meant it satisfied nobody, but offended everyone equally, the architectural equivalent of a negotiated compromise. Darius was escorted to a secured suite that was either protective custody or imprisonment depending on which side you asked. The room had human furniture and Veltheran environmental controls, suggesting someone had tried very hard to make him comfortable while also ensuring he couldn't leave without permission. General Thrace arrived 30 minutes later with 2 aides and an expression that suggested she'd been saving her anger for private venues. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked without preamble. "Stood still while everyone else ran," Darius replied. "In my defense, I wasn't aware that not fleeing was culturally significant. You've given her a propaganda victory. The Void Sovereign can now claim that even human warriors recognize her authority. You've legitimized her reign in ways 1,000 military victories couldn't accomplish." Thrace pulled up holographic displays showing news coverage from multiple systems. Veltheran networks were calling it the recognition. Human networks were calling it betrayal. Both were wrong, but nobody seemed interested in nuance. "General, with respect, I didn't pledge allegiance to her. I just didn't run away. There's a difference. Not in Veltheran culture. And now you're bound by their laws, which means you have access to their high councils, their classified intelligence, and you carry legal protections that supersede our chain of command." She leaned forward. "You're a massive security risk, Captain. If she's smart, and she's proven she's very smart, she'll use you to undermine our military structure from the inside." Darius processed that. It was sound strategic thinking, the kind that won wars. It was also depressing that the first assumption was manipulation rather than genuine recognition. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Refuse the right, publicly. Make it clear you don't accept the bond. We'll spin it as cultural misunderstanding, apologize to avoid immediate warfare, and extract you before this gets worse. And if refusing the right causes the war to restart." Thrace's expression hardened. "Then it restarts. We've been fighting for 7 years, Captain. One more war is tragic but manageable. A human soldier serving at the enemy queen's side is a propaganda disaster we might never recover from." She left him with orders to prepare a formal refusal statement. Darius sat in his cell/suite and stared at the holographic displays showing 2 civilizations arguing about the meaning of courage. His door chimed. The security panel showed Queen Ashira requesting entrance, which was either bold or insane given that this was technically human-controlled territory. Darius authorized entry because refusing seemed pointless when the person asking could probably override the locks if she wanted. Ashira entered alone, without her honor guard, a gesture that his tactical training identified as either genuine trust or calculated to appear as such. She'd removed her ceremonial armor and wore simpler robes that still managed to convey authority through cut and bearing. "Your general wants you to refuse the right," she said. "Not a question. She makes compelling arguments about propaganda and security risks," Darius replied. "Want to tell me why she's wrong?" "I don't think she is wrong. From her perspective, I'm the enemy who killed millions of humans. Of course she sees manipulation in my actions." Ashira moved to the window showing the station's view of local space, contested territories spreading in all directions. "Every time I've tried to pursue peace," Ashira continued, "the war party in my own government has sabotaged it. Every time your moderates have made overtures, your own military-industrial interests have manufactured reasons to continue fighting. This war is self-sustaining, because too many powerful entities profit from its continuation." "Why are you showing me this?" Darius asked. "Because the right of valor grants you legal authority that exists outside normal military command structures." A consort witness can examine classified materials without normal security clearances, can speak in high councils without facing courts-martial, can question orders from superior officers and demand answers. She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to manipulate you, Captain. I'm trying to weaponize you against the conspiracy." It was so blunt that Darius almost laughed. "You're asking me to become your agent inside human military command. I'm asking you to help me end a war that neither of our peoples actually want anymore. The soldiers are tired. The civilians are suffering. The only people who benefit are the ones selling weapons and the ones who have built careers on conflict." She paused. "But I need someone who can operate in both systems. Someone both sides have to listen to because of legal protections they can't easily dismiss." "Why me?" Darius asked. "You could have invoked this right for any soldier. Why choose someone from the enemy species?" "Because you stood," Ashira said simply. "While everyone else fled, you remained. Not to challenge me, not to prove anything, but because running served no purpose. That suggests either insanity or integrity. I'm betting on integrity, Captain Kane, because I desperately need allies who possess it." She left him with access to the intelligence files, and a choice that would define everything that followed. Refuse the right and follow orders, or accept the bond and become a tool against conspiracy. Darius spent the next 2 days reviewing evidence that made him progressively angrier. The war he'd fought for 5 years, the friends he'd lost, the years in prison camps, all of it maintained artificially by people who found it profitable. Peace wasn't impossible. It was deliberately prevented. The third day brought dual ultimatums. General Thrace delivered Human Command's order: refuse the right immediately or face charges of treason. The Veltharan High Command sent their own demand through diplomatic channels. Queen Ashira must revoke the bond and submit to their authority regarding foreign policy. Both ultimatums were designed to force a crisis. Both were traps. Darius met with Ashira in a secured conference room under observation by both militaries. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles on too many fronts simultaneously. "They want us to choose," she said. "Comply and be controlled, or refuse and trigger renewed warfare." "That sounds familiar," Darius replied. "What happens if we don't choose either option?" "Then we need a third path." She pulled up the compiled evidence they'd been gathering. "We expose the conspiracy. Present proof to both high commands simultaneously. Force them to acknowledge what's really been happening. That's going to make a lot of powerful people very angry." "Yes, but angry people make mistakes. And mistakes create opportunities for change." They spent their remaining time building the case, combining her intelligence with his tactical analysis, identifying the profiteers, showing the coordination between supposed enemies. It was comprehensive and damning, and would either change everything or get them both killed. Probably both. The joint session was called for the deadline morning, assembled in Meridian Station's largest conference facility under the pretense of resolving the right dispute. Both high commands attended, human generals and admirals on one side, Veltharan nobles and military commanders on the other. Security filled every corner, weapons just visible enough to remind everyone that civilized discussion was optional. Darius stood at the central podium wearing dress uniform that someone had provided. It fit better than expected, which suggested someone in logistics had been planning for this contingency. Ashira stood beside him in full ceremonial armor, the Void Sovereign in person, the general who'd conquered systems. General Thrace spoke first. "Captain Kane, you've been ordered to formally refuse the right of valor. Do you comply?" Before Darius could answer, a Veltharan noble interrupted. "Queen Ashira, the High Command demands you revoke this unprecedented bond and submit to proper oversight of foreign relations. Do you comply?" They'd coordinated the questions, Darius realized. Both governments working together to force capitulation from their respective leaders. It was almost impressive in its blatant manipulation. Ashira smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. No. The room erupted in protests. She raised a hand and silence fell with the kind of speed that suggested people had learned not to ignore that gesture. We do not comply because the questions are irrelevant. Captain Kane, or rather, Consort Witness Kane, has invoked his authority under the right to present evidence before this assembly. Both our legal traditions require you listen. This is highly irregular, Thrace began. Yes, Darius agreed, activating the central displays. Almost as irregular as human defense contractors and Veltheran noble houses coordinating to maintain a profitable war while everyone else dies. The displays lit up with compiled evidence. Financial transactions, communication logs, classified military records from both sides showing deliberate sabotage of peace efforts. He walked them through it methodically, using the same analytical approach he applied to tactical reports. This is the Battle of Kester Station, he said, highlighting specific records. Intelligence suggested it was a Veltheran surprise attack. Except these communication logs show human defense contractors tipped off Veltheran forces about our patrol schedules. The battle happened because someone wanted it to happen. These are fabrications, a Veltheran noble protested. Then explain these financial records showing you received payments from the same shell company that supplies weapons to both sides, Ashira countered. Explain why your house's fortune has tripled since the war began. They worked through the evidence together, her intelligence combined with his tactical analysis, demonstrating pattern after pattern of coordination between supposed enemies. Attacks timed to undermine negotiations. Moderate voices assassinated by extremists who were somehow never caught. Weapons sales flowing through networks that served both species. General Thrace tried to shut them down. Veltheran commanders invoked procedural objections. But Ashira exercised her authority as monarch, and Darius exercised his right as consort witness to speak truth without consequence. They'd planned this carefully. Using legal protections, both sides had to honor to present evidence neither side could easily dismiss. The war you've been fighting, Darius told the assembled command, isn't between our species anymore. It's between a small group of profiteers and everyone else. They've been playing us against each other for 7 years because dead soldiers are profitable and peace threatens their income streams. The evidence was undeniable. Some officials were arrested on the spot, those with the clearest proof of conspiracy. Others attempted to flee and were detained by security forces who'd apparently been briefed in advance. The conspiracy unraveled in real time because exposure was the one thing it couldn't survive. Captain Darius Kane stood in a maintenance corridor on the Raxus IV, while the galaxy's most feared queen crossed an empty battlefield toward him. Everyone else had fled. Evacuation ships departed without him. He was alone with terror and the choice every soldier faces eventually: run toward safety or stand for something that might matter. He stood. Not because he was brave, though others would call it courage. Not because he knew what would happen, though historians would analyze his decision for generations. He stood because running felt like surrendering to fear, and he'd already spent too many years being afraid. Queen Ashira Kal recognized something in that choice, in the simple refusal to flee when fleeing made tactical sense. She invoked an ancient right that bound them together, not through romance or politics, but through shared recognition of what courage actually means when stripped of glory and propaganda. Together, they exposed a conspiracy that had maintained warfare for profit. They forced both militaries to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about who really benefited from endless conflict. They dismantled a system that had seemed permanent through the simple act of refusing to accept it as inevitable. A year later, the war was ending, not through dramatic battle or negotiated surrender, but through the unglamorous work of building institutions that made peace more profitable than conflict. Darius split his time between human and Veltheran territories, serving as consort witness, a bridge between civilizations who were slowly learning cooperation. Ashira ruled with renewed authority, the profiteers faced justice, and the galaxy discovered that sometimes the most important warriors are the ones who stand still when everyone else runs. Reporters still asked him about that day on the Raxus IV. Why didn't he flee like everyone else? Darius's answer never changed, because some decisions aren't about tactics or survival. They're about deciding what kind of person you want to be when everything else falls away. I decided to be the kind who stands. And the queen called the void sovereign, the scar of stars, the most feared entity in the galaxy, learned that courage recognized has a way of inspiring courage in others. The fragile peace held not because it was easy, but because enough people were finally willing to stand their ground and defend it. The war ended not with a bang, but with 1,000 small acts of people refusing to run from difficult truths. And it started with one soldier standing alone on an empty battlefield, facing fear with nothing, but the simple conviction that staying mattered more than safety. The memorial they built on the Raxus IV marked the spot where Darius had stood. It wasn't grand, just a simple marker noting the coordinates where the right of valor was invoked. But visitors came from both species, standing on scorched ground that had hosted terror and choosing to remember the moment when someone refused to let fear win. Ashira visited on the anniversary as she did every year. Darius met her there as he always did, standing in the same spot where everything changed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. They'd had this conversation before, would probably have it many more times. "I gave you an impossible choice that day." "You gave me a choice that mattered," Darius corrected. "Most of my career was following orders and hoping they made sense. That day, I got to decide what I stood for, literally." She smiled, not the void sovereign's calculated expression, but something genuine that her closest advisors rarely saw. "The High Command still complains about you. They say a human warrior has too much influence in Veltharan affairs. Your High Command needed someone to complain about after we arrested half of them," Darius replied. "I'm a convenient target, keeps them distracted while you actually govern. And your generals, how do they handle having a consort witness who questions their decisions?" "They hate it, which is how I know I'm doing something right." They stood together watching ships from both species sharing orbital space, freighters and passenger transports instead of warships, commerce replacing conflict. It wasn't perfect peace. There were still tensions, still factions that wanted to return to the old certainties of warfare. But the framework held because enough people on both sides had decided it was worth defending. A group of Veltharan students approached, recognizing the Queen. They were young enough that the war was history rather than memory, which meant they could ask questions with the bluntness of those who hadn't lived through the trauma. "Is it true you invoked the right because he was the only one who stayed?" one asked. Ashira considered the question seriously. "I invoked the right because standing when everyone else flees is the purest form of courage. Not the courage of glory or victory, but the courage of simply refusing to surrender to fear. That's the foundation my people's empire was built upon, before we forgot what it meant." "But he's human," another student pointed out. "Doesn't that make it complicated?" "Everything worth doing is complicated," Darius said. "If it was easy, someone would have done it already." The students left with more questions than answers, which Ashira suggested was appropriate for young people learning to navigate a galaxy more complex than their textbooks admitted. Later, back on Station Meridian in the shared offices where they coordinated between governments, Darius reviewed reports from the frontier territories. Trade agreements being honored. Mixed settlements where humans and Veltharan were learning to coexist. Problems, certainly. Cultural misunderstandings, economic tensions, the occasional incident that required careful diplomacy. But problems were better than warfare, and diplomacy was cheaper than munitions. General Thrace visited his office, which happened monthly now that she'd been promoted to lead the Joint Military Oversight Committee. She'd never forgiven him for complicating her war, but she'd grudgingly admitted that peace was preferable to the alternative. "The Senate wants a report on Veltheran military readiness," she said, dropping a data tablet on his desk. "They're concerned about fleet movements near the border." Darius scanned the tablet. "These are trade escorts protecting commercial ships. The concerning fleet movements are cargo vessels with standard security." "I know that, you know that. But senators who built careers on fear need something to be afraid of." She paused. "You're going to tell them that, right? In your usual diplomatic way that makes everyone uncomfortable." "Wouldn't dream of doing anything else." "Good." She turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, Kane, I still think you made a terrible decision that day, but I'm starting to understand why you made it. High praise from you, General. Don't let it go to your head. You're still a massive pain in my operational planning." After she left, Darius returned to the reports. Trade numbers were up. Joint scientific ventures were producing results. The colonies that had been battlegrounds were rebuilding. It was unglamorous work, the kind that didn't make headlines or earn medals. But it was the work that mattered, the infrastructure of peace that would outlast any single battle or dramatic gesture. Ashira joined him in the evening, reviewing her own stack of reports from Veltheran territories. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing relevant information across the cultural divide. "The Northern Territories want to establish a mixed colony," she said. "Humans and Veltheran sharing settlement rights. It would be unprecedented." "So was everything else we've done," Darius pointed out. "Might as well keep the trend going." "My advisors are concerned about the cultural complications." "Your advisors are concerned about breathing wrong. Authorize the colony. Worst case, we learn what doesn't work and adjust. Best case, we prove that cooperation is possible even at the small scale." She authorized it with the kind of confidence that came from having made harder decisions. The colony would succeed or fail on its own merits, but at least they'd given it a chance. They finished their work past midnight, station time. The offices were quiet except for the hum of environmental systems, the machinery that kept everyone alive in the hostile void. Darius thought about his old job maintaining those systems, fixing problems that nobody noticed until they failed. Peace was like that, invisible infrastructure that only became apparent when it broke down. "Do you miss it?" Ashira asked, apparently following his train of thought. "The simplicity of before, when your biggest concern was malfunctioning air filters." "Sometimes," Darius admitted. "Life was easier when I was invisible. But easy isn't the same as meaningful. That day on the Raxus IV, when everyone fled and I stood alone, that was the first time in years I felt like I was making a choice that mattered beyond my next assignment." "You stood because everyone else ran." "I stood because running felt like surrendering something important. Couldn't articulate what at the time, but I knew if I fled, I'd regret it more than whatever happened if I stayed." Ashira was quiet for a moment. "My people tell stories about the Void Sovereign, the queen who conquered systems and showed no mercy. They made me into a legend of terror, but legends are prisons of their own kind. Everyone expects the monster, so you perform it even when you want something different. And then some idiot human didn't run," Darius said. "Disrupted the whole performance." "Exactly," she smiled. "You reminded me that courage isn't about conquest or glory. It's about standing for something when standing is difficult. That's the empire I want to build, not one founded on fear, but one built by people brave enough to choose differently when everyone else flees." They left the offices together, walking the quiet corridors of Station Meridian, where representatives from a dozen species now worked side by side. The war was ending. Not through dramatic victory, but through the accumulated weight of people choosing cooperation over conflict, even when conflict was more familiar. Darius thought about that battlefield on the Raxus IV. The empty ground where he'd stood alone, facing terror with nothing but stubborn refusal to run. That moment had defined everything that followed, not because it was heroic, but because it was honest. He'd made a choice about the kind of person he wanted to be, and he'd stood by it when standing was hardest. The galaxy was learning the same lesson, slowly and with difficulty. Peace wasn't dramatic. It didn't offer the clarity of warfare or the simple certainties of conquest. But it was better. It was work worth doing. And sometimes, the most important warriors were the ones who simply refused to flee when everyone else ran. The rite of valor had bound them together. Human and Veltheran, soldier and queen, two people who recognized courage in each other when circumstances made recognition difficult. Together they dismantled a conspiracy, ended a profitable war, and built the foundations of something better. Years later, when historians analyze the turning point in human-Veltheran relations, they debate strategy and politics and the larger forces that shaped events. But those who'd been there knew the truth was simpler and more profound. One soldier stood his ground when standing served no tactical purpose. One queen recognized courage when politics suggested she shouldn't. And from that moment, everything changed. Not because they were heroes or legends or figures from propaganda, but because they chose, in a moment when choice was difficult, to be people who stood for something worth defending. The war ended not with a bang, but with 1,000 small acts of courage compounding into transformation.